Hello everyone, Ayato's Rerun is finally here. I've had the joy of pulling him and playing him since his first banner, and with Hydra being able to perform so many reactions, I've played him and tested him in a wide variety of teams, all of which are strong, but I want to share with you the teams that stood out the most to me so you can enjoy your Ayato to the fullest and deal some crazy damage in game. When I explain these teams, I'll go over the team's specific rotation, as well as any changes you should make to a character's build if there are any changes to begin with. Without further ado, let's begin. The first team is Vaporize. Vaporize overall is just a really good reaction to begin with, yet with certain teams and characters, Ayato can make this reaction even better. There are two different Vaporize comps that do this, the first team being Bennett, Kazuha, and Xiangling. This team is amazing as first off, this team deals a lot of damage. Through the Vaporize reaction, you can see Ayato at times deal near 40,000 damage, and Xiangling deal around 25,000 damage. Even Ayato's and Xiangling's own personal damage is a lot through Kazuha and Bennett, and overall it's just satisfying to use this team as there's so much pyro and hydra being applied to enemies, so it's very easy to vaporize. Another big upside of this team is that Ayato's burst can be used here. Usually you don't want to use bursts like Ayato since it will mess up your reaction, but this team applies so much pyro that this problem doesn't occur. It's actually more beneficial to use Ayato's burst since it will deal passive damage to enemies while buffing Ayato's skill damage considerably. Plus you get to see him stare at you seductively for a few seconds, so you know, there's no harm in that. Anyways. To begin the rotation of this team, first use Ayato's burst, then switch to Kazuha and use his skill to swirl Hydro, then switch to Bennett and use his burst, do the same for Xiangling and use her skill after. Now switch to Kazuha and use his burst to also buff Xiangling. Finally change back to Ayato and use his skill to finish off the rotation. Of the characters' builds, everyone can be used in the normal builds, but to maximize your damage, one of the pyro characters should be a battery with the Favonius weapon, while the other should be meant for damage or to buff other characters' damage further, which is my case as I've given Bennett a high base attack weapon. Also, I highly recommend to use the Lion's Roar on Ayato if you have it to a high refinement. Because of its passive, the sword is pretty much the best of all swords for Vaporize, unless you have an R5 5-star weapon. The other comp of Vaporize Ayato that's also very good is Sunfire Ayato. This team deals good damage and has a very simple and easy to perform rotation. Moreover, this team is able to make use of really good benefits that the last team cannot. The last character in this team is a flex spot. You can use any character you'd like, but I'd recommend to use either Yunjin to greatly buff Ayato's normal attacks, or Kazuha to battery Jean and group enemies, which Jean can do, but her grouping isn't as easy and effective as Kazuha's. The rotation starts off by just using bursts, first Ayato's, then Yunjin's, and Bennett's. Then switch to Jean and use her skill and burst so Jean can pick up particles while in her burst animation, then end the rotation with Ayato's skill. Triggering Vaporize with this team is effortless, with Bennett and Jean's bursts being placed on top of each other. Jean's Dandelion field will be swirling pyro, which in turn will constantly affect enemies with pyro, making Vaporize very simple and easy to do. With Bennett and Yunjin, Ayato's slashes will be quite strong, while Jean will be dealing crazy swirls nearing 20k. On top of this team has the benefit of greatly increasing Ayato's attack speed with the right constellations. With Jean C2 and Yunjin C6, Ayato can have his attack speed increased by 27%. This makes a huge difference if you have these constellations, but even if you don't, this is still good since there's a lot of room to grow in this already great team. For builds, since Jean will be swirling with her burst, she should be built with triple EM, but if you struggle to regain her burst fast enough, you can give her a crit rate circlet and run the Favonius sword on her. Speaking of energy recharge, as you can tell, this team is very burst heavy, so you should run 2 Favonius weapons in this team. It'd be best if Bennett and Yunjin run these weapons, though Yunjin's crit rate will be low. As long as it's around the mid 30s, she can still reliably trigger the passive. If not, either switch her out for someone that can use the Favonius weapon properly, or as I mentioned earlier, you can give it to Jean. Try to give Jean around 170 energy, and try to level her to level 90 as this will increase her swirl damage by 34%. This is a considerable increase in damage, but you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Let's now talk about a team that isn't seen as one of Ayato's best teams, but legitimately is, and that is Freeze Ayato, or more appropriately called Permafreeze Ayato. In this team, Ayato can be played as a main or burst DPS, yet regardless of how you play him, enemies will literally be frozen the entire time and take tons of damage. The reason Permafreeze is so strong and works so well is because of Ayato's burst. It has a big radius and has quadratic scaling, meaning that if two enemies are near each other and are hit by his burst, both enemies will take damage. Ayato's burst heavily resembles Ganyu's, and that's actually the reason why Permafreeze works so well. Stacking these two bursts together with their great properties deals a lot of damage, especially if enemies are grouped together, which you want to do. Now that's not to say you can't only use Ganyu, you can use other cryo characters, but Ganyu is the best in this case. Next to Ganyu, I really like to use Ayaka in his team since her burst is very strong and she greatly adds to the deadliness of this team. Like Ayato, Ayaka can be played as the main or burst DPS. I switch between these two being DPSs, yet whoever you decide to be the burst DPS, to get the most out of their bursts, you'll want to give these characters 4-piece emblem. For the main DPS, you can take advantage of 4 Blizzard Strayer. This set will grant huge amounts of crit rate to your DPS, so you can stack as much crit damage on them as possible. Lastly, to reliably recharge your bursts and keep your rotation smooth, I highly recommend to have at least one character with the Favonius weapon. I've given 2 of my characters Favonius weapons, that being Ganyu and Kazuha with the crit rate circlet. 2 of these weapons allow my characters to get their burst with no problem, but I know 2 is a bit much, so you can use 1 if you'd like to. Now regarding the rotations of this team, it will differ a bit with who you play as the main DPS, but honestly there isn't a strict rotation you have to follow for this team. Rather, there's some guidelines to make your rotations as good as possible. When you start your rotation, it's best to start off with Ayato's burst because his burst has a longer cooldown and higher energy cost than Ganyu's, so you want to get his burst ticking down right away and you want him to gather as much energy from your rotations as possible. Lastly, if you do end up using Ayaka, her burst is very important and can be extremely good when used properly. To properly and effectively use her burst when enemies are already frozen through Ganyu's and Ayato's burst, and are grouped up together by an animal support. Ayaka's burst will damage all enemies at once if they're grouped, so all enemies will take massive damage. Now let's get into a Dendro team. In truth, Ayato fares well in basically all Dendro teams. He applies Hydra well to where Dendro cores are produced quite efficiently, so he's a good option for all Dendro teams. And after testing all Dendro reactions and teams Ayato can be played in, I found Hyper Bloom to be the strongest. See, the damage of Hyper Bloom is very high thanks to the cores actually being directed at enemies and not just exploding on the ground. A common occurrence I found with Dendro teams like Bloom is that cores will take too long to actually explode, and when they do finally explode, enemies have already moved and are too far to actually be hit. For Hyper Bloom, this never happens. This team is also very good thanks to Raiden or Kuki Shinobu, who you can use instead, as these two will provide constant electro application to where cores are frequently being shot at enemies, and with the new EM sets and EM weapons, the damage of these cores are very high. In this team, since Ayato simply produces cores for Hyper Bloom to occur, he can be built as he normally is. With Raiden triggering Hyper Bloom, she should be purely built on EM. For Bennett, he is a flex bot. You can instead play other buffers or sub DPSs like Xingqiu, but I played him because he'll increase Ayato's and Nahida's personal damage, which does play a big role in this team's overall damage. For Raiden's specific build, her weapon should either be the Dragon's Bane, the Moon Piercer, or the Katane Cross Spear. Her artifact main stats, as mentioned, should all be EM. As for artifact sets, the best set for Hyper Bloom is 4 Flower of Paradise Lost, followed by 4 Gilded Dreams, and lastly any 2 sets granting 80 Elemental Mastery. And again, like Sunfire Jean, it's best if you level up Raiden to level 90, as this will increase her Hyper Bloom damage. For Benny's build, should you use him, he can use his usual 4 Noblesse. However, it'd be best to instead use 4 Instructor for the EM bonus. Now with Benny's weapon, you'll want to give him the Favonius sword because there won't be a battery for the team, as Raiden won't be using her burst, rather only her skill. This team's rotation is first Raiden's skill to buff everyone's burst, now change to Bennett and use his burst, then change to Ayato and cast his burst. Next, switch to Nahida and cast her skill and burst. Lastly, change again to Ayato and use his skill to perform Hyper Bloom. The next team is one team that I feel doesn't get enough attention, and that is Mono Hydro. Now, don't let this reactionless team fool you. Despite no reactions, this team is very strong and is able to output very high single target damage. The reason being is that each character is very strong, and when combined, they're even stronger as all of these units complement each other really well. First off, with passive damage of Xingqiu and Yelan, the DPS of this team starts off amazing. Then Xingqiu will increase everyone's Hydra damage through reducing enemies' Hydra resistance, while Yelan will buff Ayato's damage with her damage increasing passive. Then with Kazuha's buffs and shreds, enemies are blown out of the water and the team's damage skyrockets. When playing this team, begin with Ayato's burst, switch to Yelan and use her skill and immediately use her burst so she can pick up her skill particles. Do the opposite for Xingqiu, use first his burst and then his skill. Change to Kazuha and use his ultimate right away to pick up Xingqiu's particles, and then use Kazuha's skill. Finally, use Ayato's skill and admire all of the blue numbers. Now each character is vital to the team. With other Hydra units, the team does fall off, so I highly recommend to use Yelan and Xingqiu. Kazuha is also very important with his Hydra damage bonus, but he can be replaced with Sucrose or any other animal character with 4 Iridescent. In regard to the energy of this team, for the 3 Hydra characters, energy isn't a problem. However, it is for Kazuha, so it's best to run Favoni's weapons on Yelan and Xingqiu. The 2 will want to run energy weapons anyway for the most part, so this isn't sacrificing their damage, rather it's beneficial since now you can give Kazuha as much EM as possible without worrying much about his energy. That said, try to run a decent amount of energy on him, around 135 energy. If you're still on the fence regarding this team, a great upside of this team is that every character is built normally, so if you're unsure whether a Hydra team without reactions is strong, you don't have to invest any new resources into this team. You can just use the characters as they are and test if you like the team. Well everyone, that is all the teams I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video and try out the teams I mentioned. I'd love to know, what do you think about Ayato? And how good do you think these teams are? Do you have other teams that you prefer using Ayato in? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. Take care, and thank you all once again.